Welcome to Worlds of Speculative Fiction, session number 95. This time we are following up our previous session, which was focused on Ken Liu's The Grace of Kings, the beginning of the Dandelion Dynasty 4-book sequence, with the second book in the sequence, which is even longer and arguably has even greater scope, The Wall of Storms, which we'll, of course, talk about, this reference to a wall of storms, which plays an important role. So this is the second book in the Dandelion Dynasty series. A number of characters who you've come to know and love will find out their fates. A number of other characters are introduced. The scope of the world building continues to extend itself, and there's an awful lot to say about this. So this is Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We're going to talk about the world building first. We'll go into some of the things that are different. There'll be a bit of review of the previous work since it feeds directly into this. And we'll also talk about some of the really important philosophical themes that are either explicitly woven into the book. We'll find some interesting analogs in philosophical schools to some of the classical schools of Chinese philosophy, but there's so many other really important philosophical themes that Liu is either, being very clear about through the characters, their thoughts, their actions, their words, or which are lurking in the background. So there's a lot to say about this. We already did a biographical discussion, so we don't need to do that again with this particular session, but if you want to, you can go back to the earlier session, number 94, and learn about Liu's biography, which is quite interesting. So if this is something new to you, if this is your first Worlds of Speculative Fiction, let me just say a little bit about the series. We started doing this as an in-person, face-to-face, but recorded series back in 2016. We are now in year 10 of the series. You notice that this is a little bit different than just recording an in-person session. That's because during COVID, we switched to this new format, which has me talking, giving you some lecture, hopefully some interesting discussion, anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes. We premiere this as a video, which then, while it's premiering, I engage with whoever wants to show up in conversation in the chat afterwards through comments and things like that. And after we have the video premiere, we meet for a Zoom session to continue the conversation. So we've been doing this off and on with a few breaks for 10 years. This is session 95. We're pretty soon going to be reaching session 100, which I think is kind of a cool milestone to reach. And we may down the line get to the other two books of this amazing Dandelion Dynasty. I think it's a really awesome series. I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it, you can still watch this and get a lot out of it. If you have read it, hopefully, then what we're doing here contributes to your understanding of what you took from at least this novel. So sit back. We got a lot to cover and delve into. We won't get to everything in a time that's long, but actually quite short for plumbing the depths of a novel that turns out to be 858 pages in this particular edition. So, with no further ado, let's talk first about the world that this is set within. So, since this is Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we spend a good bit of time exploring the world building going on within a particular author who we're focusing on. And in the case of Liu and the Dandelion Dynasty novels, it is incredibly rich, so much so that he actually coined a term to describe the aesthetic, the sort of guiding sensibility behind it, silkpunk. Obviously, he's drawing quite a bit on not just parallels to East Asian, particularly Chinese settings and histories and novels, but also on a number of other important facets as well. But as we're going to see when we look at the interviews, Liu doesn't want this to just be China in another place. So there's a lot of really interesting facets to this. I also want to point out, before we jump right in, that some people, and this is a theme that we'll maybe pick up a little bit more later on, have said that this is similar to the Song of Ice and Fire of George R. Martin, in that there's a lot of intersecting stories. There is more than one dimension in which conflicts and cooperation and developments are taking place, and lots of characters, many of whom we could say, not only don't completely fulfill their possible potential, but also meet some unfortunate ends, typically at the hands of other characters. And as the novels are proceeding, the world is also getting bigger. It's getting bigger both geographically, with the introduction in this book in particular of a new group of people who are going to be invading the setting that functions as the main setting still for Wall of Storms, but was the only setting for the previous book, The Grace of Kings. And, those people are bringing some different sensibilities. And we could say that it's not only geographic expansion and people's coming together, it's also an expansion in thinking and conceiving and social organization that's going on. And that produces a lot of hiccups. So I think the place to begin, before we actually talk about Wall of Storms, is to just briefly mention the setting of the previous book, which carries on in a continuity into this second book in the series. So Grace of Kings takes place in an island chain of Dara. So there's this central island, which includes a lot of former states, all now part of one big empire. And then there's a number of other islands around it, some of which are their own kingdoms. For example, the kingdom that came to rule as the empire, Zana, unifying all of the states. And so we've got all of these islands set around with different peoples on them, known for different things. And what we have is an empire that's very new, under a dominant military power who is imposing not just heavy taxes, but also forced labor. And gradually, a rebellion begins, and it spreads across, and the imperial forces are fighting against the rebel forces, who aren't all completely on the same page. And one of the people who is particularly important at that time is from one of the old states. He's part of a previous, we could say, lineage, right? And that is Madazindu, who becomes the hegemon. And he's this totally martial guy. He's the chrysanthemum. Then we have his self-proclaimed brother, friend, trickster fellow who winds up taking on great responsibility. Kunigaru, who is the dandelion in the Dandelion Dynasty. And eventually they win, but there's tensions between them and people causing trouble, and eventually Kunigaru is, forced to sort of subjugate himself and his followers and go off to another state where he ends up raising a rebellion. And we get these two, now we could say, dominant powers, the chrysanthemum and the dandelion, on two sides of the islands. And eventually they come to a peace, which then Kunigaru, following advice given to him by one of his advisors, another major character, is going to he's going to break the ceasefire, betray the hegemon, and take over. And now he is the new emperor. So we have one previous empire, analogous to the Qin dynasty, in the time of the Warring States, unifying everything and running everything according to a fairly tough guy sort of mentality that we associate with the Chinese legalist school. In here, the incentivist school. That's ending up being replaced by Kunigaru's new empire, which is going to be analogous to the Han Dynasty in many respects. So some really interesting stuff going on there in the backstory. And then it's a matter of reconstructing society. And so this story is picking up years later when a good degree of order has been imposed and new institutions are beginning to take form, but there's a lot of tensions in how things are going on. So the other thing I want to bring up as well is the titular wall of storms that is being discussed in this book. And we're going to get an interesting description of it later on. So I mentioned what we've got here is essentially a big island civilization centered around a major island with a lot of other islands around it. So these are seafaring people in large part, and they try to explore the areas around them. As a matter of fact, the previous emperor sent out some big fleets with city ships to try to see what's actually out there, what's going on. And many of them run into this wall of storms, which appears to surround the entirety of this island domain. And the wall of storms are these gigantic cyclones that will tear apart anything that runs into it, which means ships. And so the wall of storms winds up being kind of a container. But it's somewhat permeable, as we're going to find out. And we're going to learn this in part through the scientific endeavors of one of the main characters who I talked about already, Luan Zia, who will become the teacher of another major character in this work. So what else should we say about this? Well, the royal court of the new empire has become a place where a lot of different elements are coming together and having to kind of work out where do they actually fit. And so we've got all these old, generals and marshals fighting. We actually have a character who proclaimed herself a queen of a territory who's allowed to hold on to that. Jin Mizadi, one of the most interesting characters, I would say, in the entire sets of novels. We also have the Empress Jia, who is trying to bring about, we could say, a kind of political revolution, a shift away from personal loyalty and trust to institutions, as we're going to read a little bit later on. And there's reorganization happening. Should the old people, who were the nobility, have a role in this? Should they take power? Should they have a feudal type of system? Or should it be one unified state? And there are new rebellions that begin, some of which are associated with a cult of the hegemon, now viewed as sort of a heavenly figure. There's all sorts of interesting twists and turns that are going on. There's betrayals taking place. The kids of the emperor, now known as Emperor Ragan, both from Gia and the consort Rhysana, but also from another consort who died. There's 4 children, each of whom has a possible claim to the throne. There's Timu, who's very scholarly. We're going to encounter him later. There's Thera, who's going to play a major role in this. There's Phiro, who, unlike those two, is the son of consort Rhysana, who is more of a martial type. And then we have the youngest, Farah. And they are main characters in this and witnesses to what is going on. We also see that there is this examination process, this institution that is it's already there to begin with, but it's being expanded and recreated thoughtfully. And we have a major character as well who's going to rise through this, a very intelligent daughter of a man who's, essentially dragooned onto these ships under the emperor, and her poor mother, and she's struck by lightning and crippled because of it, but she's very inquisitive. Her name is Zomi, and she is going to be a student of Luanzia. Meanwhile, we have the restoration of all sorts of interesting rituals and forms going on underneath Zato Ruthi, who was at one time a king of one of the subjugated states. So we've got all of this backstory happening and providing us not just with a setting in the sense of now we have the characters and they do their things. The setting is being formed and reformed by all of these people. Now, the last thing I need to say before we start looking at some of the passages that are depicting this is that a new wild card comes in, and that drastically expands the scope of this, both ideologically and we could say geographically, because a people invade, and they are originally nomadic, herding people who have these dragon-like creatures, the Garifin. We're going to see them being kind of a form of technology. They actually milk them as well and use the fermented milk. They're kind of like the Mongols in some respect. And they are going to end up invading. These are the Liaku, who establish an empire fairly quickly. In the story, they're far off to the west, and they find a way to get through the Wall of Storms because somebody else gets through the Wall of Storms as well, namely some of these city ships from the previous empire on Dara. And that catalyzes their civilization. It allows them a expanded conception of not just the world, but the possibilities for how to live and how to organize things. So they're another group that's unified out of a whole set of disparate people, and they become very strong, and they wind up invading the empire islands of Dara. So that becomes another major theme within the work. Now, I want to begin by bringing up some things that we haven't talked about in this session yet, but we did talk about in the previous session, and that is the gods. There are gods who take a somewhat active role within this setting of Dara. So we have the gods getting together, and they had previously played around with the different characters in the earlier work, and now they're having a kind of, discussion with each other. So we have the shark, Paui of Tazu, master of unpredictable waters, leapt out of the sea. The Mingan falcon, Paui of Kija, lord of the winds, swooped down and let out a challenging cry. What are you laughing about, Tazu? The god of birds has been driven out of his home by winged barbarians. I think most would find it funny. Have you lost all compassion? You laugh now, but they will come for your home on Wolf's Paw too. I laugh at everything, brother. You laugh at nothing. That's the root of your problem. The scale clouds roiled as Tutika, the last-born of the gods, interrupted in her clear musical voice. Stop bickering! All of Dara is under threat. All the islands, all the people, all the gods, we must do something. The wave wolves howled as Fithaweo, the warlike, joined the discussion. Are you suggesting we go to war against the Liuku? What about our pact to not directly interfere in the affairs of the mortals? The Liuku aren't the people of Dara. The pact doesn't apply. The great shark showed off its deadly grin again. Such sophistry. What does the people of Dara mean? This is not the first time invaders have come to these shores. These islands were inhabited before the coming of the Ano, which was not even that long ago in the eyes of the eternal stars. We didn't do much to protect those people of Dara from the slaughter, did we? During the Diaspora War, some of us fought against them, some of us fought with them, and some of us did both. And it seems all of us ended up preferring the incense and music and sacrificial meals and great temples offered up by the descendants of the Ano more than the rough-hewn woodland shrines of the people whose remnants now live on Tan Adu. Isn't this but another turn in the eternal wheel of change? Remember, we're not mortals. Their concerns are not the same as ours. The other gods were silent for a while, but eventually the gentle dove of Rufizo spread its wings over the brooding sea. The coming of the Ano was a time of bloodshed and widespread death, and you're right that all of us did things we're not proud of during the Diaspora Wars, but we were different then. Younger, more like children who did not know the difference between good and evil. Just as the descendants of the original inhabitants of these islands have merged with the Ano to become the people of Dara, we've also changed. We've altered the way we dress, the way we speak, the way we fight and debate and love because of the Ano. All of us have walked among them in mortal form and taken them as lovers. The Ano have changed us with their worship and philosophy and culture as much as we have changed them with our guidance and persuasion. I would hope we have grown in our sense of responsibility. The shark's grin was now more like a sneer as he answered, You sound like a mortal moralist, one of the philosophical schools we'll look at shortly. But how do you know that in 1,000 years these strangers who call themselves the Liuku will not also build great temples to us and praise our names and think of themselves as the people of Dara? The spears of the original inhabitants of these islands have rotted away and their bones lie deep in the soil, but the islands are still here, and so are we. I say, let them fight as they will, and we can go on playing our games with them as before. Doesn't Kunigaru always speak of doing interesting things? I think it's most interesting to watch people kill each other, especially when the Liuku have these wonderful beasts. Now came the turn for the twins of Kokru, stubborn and patient Rapa, the goddess of sleep and rest, and impulsive and volatile Kana, the goddess of death and fire. We have shaped the people of Dara, just as the people of Dara have shaped us, my sister, and we're responsible in part for the crisis facing Dara today. The black crow of Kana looked at the shark of Tazu, who carelessly flipped in the water, and the white crow of Rapa, who looked away and said nothing. We can't just stand by. The Liuku worship their own deities, Tazu. You are the jealous sort. Aren't you worried that if they win, we will be forgotten and fade away? But the shark was unfazed. Among the gods, they worship as one they call the All-Father, and another they call the Every-Mother. Who knows if the All-Father isn't just another name for our father, Thasoluo. He was called away by Moano, the king of all deities, and it might be he went to other lands and begot other children. The sea is vast, and other worlds lay beneath the horizon, as these Leiku have proven. Would you break the spirit of the promise we made to our mother and go to war against our father's children from beyond the sea? The white crow of Rapa screeched angrily at the shark. That is pure speculation. We haven't even met these other gods. You just want more people to die. What of it? I thought your twin sister would welcome the prospect. Who says I don't look out for my siblings? The black crow cawed. Death is my domain, but that doesn't mean that's all I care for. Then they finally get to the end. Where is that old turtle? I haven't seen him since the appearance of the city ships. None of the gods could recall seeing their storm-braving brother, wisest of the gods. So, very interesting discussions there, right? The gods themselves don't know everything, and they're not sure exactly what to do about this invasion. A little bit later on, we are going to have this interesting conversation between Defiro and Chief Kaizen, and we read that by comparing our stories, both those we remember and those we learn from your books, with the stories of the gods of Dara and Anno records, we made an astounding discovery. The early Anno sagas had several different versions of the creation myth, as well as deeds by deities with names that did not appear in later accounts. The creation myth that eventually came to dominate is the one you know well, the parting of Thasulo from Dara Mea, the creation of the islands from her tears, and the simultaneous birth of the young gods of Dara. The Pharaoh nodded, uncertain what this meant. This is a myth remarkably similar to our own creation story, though differing in several important respects. Our storytellers tell of the creation of the race of men from Daramea's blood as she gave birth to the gods, a detail absent from the Anno accounts, and in our stories, Tazu was a goddess, not a god who sometimes took on the feminine aspect. Which version do you think is the truth? That is not something mere mortals can ever find out, but I have a theory as to what happened. When the Anno first came to these shores, they brought with them their own gods, different from those you now know as the gods of Dara, who were worshipped by the natives, our ancestors. Their own gods? Defiro was so shocked he did not know what to think. Yes, the gods of the Anno had their own names, their own spheres of power, and their own stories. Some of these were recorded in the earliest sagas, but they became neglected in later ages. As the Anno fought and mingled with the natives, they learned about our gods and myths, and over time came to identify their gods with ours. For example, their god of fire was melded to our goddess of the volcanoes. Our trickster goddess was seen as an echo of their trickster god. Our healing god was reinterpreted as a kind shepherd. Elements of the Anno homeland were transplanted onto our gods, and they prayed to them as though they were still praying to the gods of home. As the chief explained, he pointed out various statues for Defiro's attention, a whalebone statue of a goddess whose ample breasts were carved from coral and shaped like Mount Rapa and Mount Kana, a wood carving of a goddess who had the lower body of a shark, a figurine made from the pure white horn of a Cruben whose expression of serene mercy was universally understood. Why would they do this? Asked Defiro. Who knows? But I suspect the gods are rooted to places they considered home, and the Anno gods were brought here in name only, not in substance. The Anno needed the presence of divinity in their lives, and the easiest solution was to pray to gods who would answer, our gods, while giving them familiar clothing and habits and viewing them as reflections of the deities they already knew. And the gods of Dara agreed to this? The gods are mysteries, Defiro Miro. We understand not their thoughts or desires, but I imagine being a god is not terribly different from being a king, where power is concerned. Both prefer the strong as followers and worshippers. If the Anno were more powerful than our ancestors, would it not make sense for the gods to favor them over us? Just as the gods direct our affairs, perhaps the mortal world also influences the celestial realm. So there's a back and forth in the divine powers of whatever we want to call it, the heavens, the earth, and the human world. What we do know is that elaborate temples to the gods of Dara were built by the conquerors, and that in these temples the gods were depicted to resemble the Ano rather than the natives of these islands. Instead of praying to statues, my ancestors shifted to praying to the sky and sea, and as tales attached to the old statues were forgotten, our gods became more abstract, less dependent on specific representation. Besides taking away our land, your ancestors also took away our gods. Defira was silent, too astonished by this revelation. As the statues on these shelves had literally been taken away from Chief Kizin's people by raiders from Dara, the chief was not merely speaking metaphorically. So to answer your question, do we worship the same gods? The answer is both yes and no, because the gods have been changed by the coming of the Ano. The people of Dara, though descended from the Ano as well as the natives, see themselves as the inheritors of the Ano legacy and worship in the same manner. We, on the other hand, still honor the gods of Dara and their parents, the world father and the source of all waters, but we know that they favor the men of Dara more than us, the remnants of a defeated people. Here's where we get the payoff. My account should serve perhaps as a warning to you and yours. Just as the gods once favored the men of Dara, they may well shift their love to another people. That the gods haven't spoken their will is interesting. Okay? So the divine powers themselves, there's an interconnection with the human world. There's an implication of the limitations, both power-wise and epistemological, of the gods, that there's been some ethical growth on their part. And now we have this new people coming in, and we're going to have to see how all of that gets sorted out. So the interesting place to start, we'll look at some more world building that has to do with the distinctively human world next. I have a number of other passages picked out from this work that I think are illuminative. Obviously, with a book that's this big, every little bit can only depict a small portion of what's going on, but hopefully they're fairly representative and give you a good sense of what is happening in the story. So I'm going to begin with this section early on. After ascending to the throne, Emperor Ragan had made scholarship a centerpiece of his plan for rebuilding Dara, and Pan was now growing to rival Jinpen and Han as a center of learning. Those who distinguished themselves in the administrations could serve the emperor through posts in civil administration or by exploring and extending the frontiers of knowledge. We get a description of the examination hall, and then we have this interesting exchange. As the sun rose over the walls of the palace, Duke Rin Koda, Imperial Farsight Secretary, looked over to Koju Yelu, Prime Minister, who sat next to him on the central platform. Back when we were all in Zudi, did you ever think a day would come when the best and brightest of Dara would have to answer to one of your questions and follow my directions if they wished to advance? Rin asked. Kojo smiled placidly. I think it's best not to dwell on the past. This day is about the future. And so we learn that the Kashima, the people who are going to take the examinations, came from every corner of Dara, the fabled ancient academies of Jinpen, whose walls and porticos were draped with ivy and morning glory, the open-air schools of Muning, where lecturers and pupils roamed from hanging platforms to flat-bottomed boats floating over the sparkling waters of Lake Toyamitika, the fog-shrouded forums of Boama, where teachers and students debated ideas in the morning before heading to the sheep pastures for exercise and leisure. The hamlets, scattered in the ringwood surrounding Na Thion, where solitary scholars contemplated nature and art. The gleaming, grand, and richly furnished classrooms of Tuaza, where cosmopolitan attitudes mixed with commercial purpose. The stone-walled, leaning halls of Criffy, where ancient virtues were extolled to dull the pain of recent suffering. The private knowledge gymnasiums of Caruza, where straw mats lined the floors so that students could study books as well as the martial arts of wrestling, boxing, and swordsmanship. They were the best students in all of Dara. Emperor Ragan's system, devised by Prime Minister Koju Yelu and Imperial tutor Zatu Ruthi, was a continuation and refinement of the ancient examination systems developed in the various Tiro states and under the Zana Empire. With standardized questions and uniform scoring systems, the goal of the imperial examinations was to filter and sieve all the talent that Dara had to offer and bring forth the best to serve the emperor, regardless of the examinee's origins. So that's the theory of it, at least. It doesn't actually turn out like that necessarily, but, we're going to see that there are some oppositions to this, some reforms that have to be made. We get another interesting discussion, not having to do with the examinations, but now with some of the social changes that are taking place, with Koju, who's talking with Luan, this great scholar, right? And Koju says, not everyone is interested in politics or good at it. And Luan says, I sense fear and uncertainty among Kuni's old generals. Thinking that the Empress is intent on taking your fief and command away from you can certainly lead to some paranoia. Is it paranoia? I never spent much time with the Emperor, or the Empress. Kojo gazed at Luan. It is said that consort Risana fears the Empress because she cannot tell what the Empress wants. It is the same with the rest of us. She's done much to promote the careers of scholars and bureaucrats. But whether that's just part of the emperor's need to shift from a time of war to a time of peace or a plot of her own design, no one knows. And what's going on with Jin? That was a strange lecture she gave you. She might not have attended a private academy, but she studied the Anno classics on her own. We know she's no unlettered soldier. Jin leads all the emperor's old generals. I don't blame her for playing to her crowd. Does she resent the Empress? Jin keeps her own counsel, as you well know, but I do know that during the first year of the reign of Four Placid Seas, the Empress made an effort to befriend Jin. I believe the effort was rebuffed because Jin wants to be loyal to consort Risana, who she thought of and still does as a comrade. Luan closed his eyes and sighed. Jin, you're always so rash. Luan is Jin's former lover. They still are in love with each other. I told you to keep yourself out of palace intrigue. Right? So some very interesting prefiguration going on there. A little bit later, we get Ruthie being introduced again. Zato Ruthie was pleased with his elevation. Coming up with the protocols for the new imperial court to him seemed a task more important than mere minutiae like running an army or devising tax policies. The sort of task better relegated to people like Jin Mazzotti, who he grudgingly accepted as a colleague, and Koju Yellow. After all, the imperial courtly protocols would be the model of proper behavior for lesser courts, and the learned, who would be exemplars for the masses. This is reflective of his moralist philosophy. In this way, he had a chance to sculpt the soul of the people of Dara in accordance with moralist ideals. When he finally presented his ideas to the emperor, Kuni thought he was back in Master Loyang's classroom again. Ruthie's protocol manual was a scroll whose length stretched halfway down the grand audience hall. Master Ruthie, Kuni said, you have to create something my generals can learn. This is so complicated, I can't even keep all the ritual phrases and ceremonial walks and seating arrangements and number of bows straight. You haven't even tried, Renga. I thank you greatly for your diligence, but why don't I take a stab at simplifying this? When Kuni presented his simplified plan, now a scroll only as long as he was tall, to Zato Ruthie, the latter almost fainted from the shock. This is barely a protocol at all. Where are the classic Anno titles? Where are the model walks designed to cultivate the soul? Where are the quotations from the sages to guide debates? It's like something taken out of a folk opera to please an audience snacking on sunflower seeds and candied monkey berries. Kuni patiently explained that Master Ruthie had misunderstood. He'd simply refined Master Ruthie's ideas in a way that preserved their essence while being capable of being carried out by mere mortals. He didn't explain that he'd actually taken much inspiration from the staging of folk operas, consulting Risana to gain her expertise. Back and forth, the emperor and the master of rituals debated, trying to compromise on something that had enough formality to satisfy the desire for propriety by the old nobles and scholars, and also contained enough fun to be accepted by the emperor and his wartime companions. And eventually they settle on something. So we see some transformations taking place there as well. Then, later on, here is where we're going to find out what's going on with the Empress, Jin, who, by the way, spoiler alert here, is going to betray some of the other really important female characters as part of this very design she has, including Jin Mazzotti and the consort who she is supposed to be friends with. Right? So why is that happening? So Jin is talking here with Soto, her advisor, Gia rather, and here we go. She says, like the hegemon, Cooney places too much faith in personal trust. During the Chrysanthemum Dandelion War, he allowed Jin Mazzotti to declare herself queen, gambling that the gesture of trust would buy her loyalty. He allows each of his nobles to keep an army large enough to bring ruin upon the land. Though the islands are at peace, like the man he once called brother, Cooney has decided to build his empire upon bonds of trust between him and those who serve him. And why is that wrong? Because trust is fickle and will not bear a heavy load. Cooney has made the empire dependent on him because he thinks only he can see a path forward. That is a fragile state. Phiro, though he is young, shows the same tendencies. But in a time of great tumult, is it not best to make sure the reins are held by a man strong enough to guide the carriage? Timu doesn't have such strength. Perhaps not. But now here's where we're seeing the plan. Instead of a Dara, kept tranquil by vows of loyalty and friendship, I want a Dara founded on systems, institutions, codified behaviors that through repetition become reified. The only way to build lasting peace is to strip power away from individuals and invest it in structures. Cooney thinks that when men are moral, they will do the right thing. But I think it is only when men are doing the right thing, regardless of reasons, that they can be said to be moral. Now we're going to get a reference to the philosophical schools here. You might speak the language of the moralist, Jia, but at heart I think you're an incentivist. The only way to achieve what you wish is to reduce governance to a system of punishments and rewards. Jia smiled wistfully. It could be said that all good kings are incentivists, dressed in moralist clothing, perhaps assisted by able patternist ministers. What of the Fluxus? They live in a realm beyond mere mortals. In the sublunary sphere, we must always think the worst. So we always have to look for the possible things that are going to get screwed up. Moving on, we have some really interesting features going on here. Here is Luan Za trying to convince the captain of a ship to take them through the wall of storms. And he's gone up in this great kite. Now, he tells him, riding on a kite allows you to see quite far. During the early days of this expedition, remember how I spoke to you of the ways the islands appeared as mere indistinct tan patches set against a blue background from such heights? Mountains, valleys, waves, the spouts of whales and crubins. None of these details were visible. All that was left were large patterns, trends that could not be seen from up close. When I lived among the people of Tan Adu, the original inhabitants of the islands, I learned that the ocean was not a featureless expanse, but a tapestry woven with intricate patterns visible only to those whose hearts were still and whose minds had been primed for generations to appreciate its rhythms. The Aduans had detailed maps of the currents that flowed across the ocean, both on the surface and below it, like gilt strands in plain cloth. The currents reflected the forces of nature, of underwater valleys and volcanoes, of winds and rivers, of austral typhoons and boreal storms. Their sacred shell-entwined maps form the foundation of the detailed maps of underwater volcano ranges I eventually created. So he's talking about mapping the universe here. And he says, I don't know, Thumo. I suspect previous expeditions were stopped by that wall, the wall of storms. And then he goes on and he says, were to sail into and through it, I must find out what is beyond. But that means certain death. Don't you desire to push beyond your fears to see just how far you can go? And Thumo says, I'm not going to ask my crew to take that on. And then we get to a description of what is happening here. So the wall of storms, we should definitely say this. From west to east, a towering wall of water and roiling clouds block the horizon, made of powerful cyclones and sinuous twisters, dancing, jostling, battling each other like spinning sword dancers. The wall was the very image of primordial chaos, devoid of light save for spider cracks of lightning flashing from time to time through the murk. The unceasing rumbling of thunder made the ocean quake, shaking the very deck upon which they stood. We are gazing upon the very face of Kiji, bringer of lightning, and Tazu, master of typhoons, said Captain Thumo. He placed his hands on his chest and prayed. Only in the ancient sagas of the Anno did I read of such a thing, said Luan Zia, his voice full of awe. And I always dismiss the tale of the journey through the Wall of Storms as an allegorical myth. No matter how much we think we know or have seen, the world is still full of wonders undreamed by mankind. And they end up crossing into it. Luan Zua actually, in his kite, crosses the Wall of Storms in his cocoon and winds up in the realm of the other peoples that we're going to encounter. So we're learning a bit about them. Luan is finding out that the great expedition of Emperor Malpudere came to these islands more than 20 years ago. And we learn this about the invaders, who were themselves invaded. For decades, perhaps centuries, the people of the scrublands lived simple lives as nomadic herders of cattle, relying on the winged garifins to guard the herds as well as to provide companionship and transportation. Life was unchanging but also satisfying. Then, one day, like a vision from an old creation myth, a fleet of ships as large as floating islands appeared on the horizon. The coming of the people of Dara turned the world of the Liaku upside down. The visitors showed the Liaku how narrow their world had been, how devoid of all the joys and refinements associated with high civilization, machinery, art, literature, manners, true beauty. It was as if before the coming of the people of Dara, the Liaku had been mere worms slithering in the grass without an understanding of how falcons could soar and take in at a glance a world grander than the accumulated experience of thousands of generations of worms. The people of Dara were excellent teachers, and the Liaku and their honored guests lived in harmony for many years. This was how both Vadyu and Kudyu had learned the language of Dara, because they had caring and skilled teachers. Then one day, a calamity struck. All the visitors from Dara fell sick from some unknown plague, and every single one of them died within a few days, despite heroic efforts from the Liaku to save their teachers and friends. This is the story that's being told. In reality, what happened? The people of Dara subjugated the people of Liaku, who then led a revolution against them and took over their technology. And we're going to learn more about this. The Liaku themselves fought against themselves and other people. We hear the wars between the Agon and the Liaku are still fresh in our memories, but long before our peoples had coalesced into nations, the tribes have fought each other, as did families. I doubt there's been a single day in the history of this land when it was completely at peace. How many men and women have lost their lives in the struggle of survival? It was either kill or be killed, because this land, though vast, can provide for but a few. It was not always so. Late at night, next to the fire pits, and after everyone has had their fill of kefir, which is this alcoholic fermented milk, the elders tell stories of our past. We know from these old tales that long ago our ancestors lived in a land that was lush and green, a paradise. There the rivers flowed with honey and milk, and the bushes were heavy with soft, juicy berries, not the hard nuts that break teeth. In that land our cattle calved each spring without fail, and there were no wolves to steal from us. Our ancestors dined on plenty, and every parent could have as many children as they wanted, not having to worry about how many they could keep alive. War was unknown because there was enough for everyone. And our ancestors then angered the All-Father somehow. The stories of the tribes don't agree on this. Some say it was because they stole the special kefir the All-Father kept for his immortal children, the purified spirits who dwell in the mountains and clouds and whom we worship. Some say it was because they had become slothful and arrogant due to their life of leisure and ease, and they disobeyed the All-Father's command to keep the celestial herd well watered and fed. Some said it was because they'd forgotten the virtues instilled in them by the All-Father and fell to greed and internecine strife. Whatever the reason, the All-Father cast us out of paradise and placed us here so our lives may be hard and our faith sharpened by suffering. But we have learned something new and momentous. The All-Father has prepared another land for us, a new paradise called Dara. Have you heard the stories the savages of Dara tell? Over there, the rivers overflow with delicious wine, kefir made from fruit, and fat fish practically leap out of the water onto your plates. The fields are so green and lush they could feed all of us and our cattle and garifans, even if we were as numerous as the stars in the skies. Families there may have a dozen children, a dozen! And the old die peacefully in sleep while the young honor their memories by multiplying and being fruitful. Luxury greets you everywhere you look. Shiny metal poking out of the ground. Great sky-clawing trees arrayed in dense forests. Sparkling jewels dangling from every ear and neck like ripe berries. This is the land we should live in. But Peck retinue, I hear some of you say. That land is already inhabited. That's right. But look at what manner of inhabitants they are. Arrogant, soft, lazy, devoid of virtue. They arrived at our shores as terrified refugees who had almost run out of food and water. We took them as honored guests, shared our food and kefir with them, and offered them all they needed. And for this hospitality, how have they repaid us? They acted as though they belonged to the race of immortal spirits, though they knew perfectly well they were but ordinary mortals like you or me. They deliberately infected us with sicknesses previously unknown in this land. And then they slaughtered our warriors with better weapons and think that makes them superior. But the measure of a warrior is in her spirit, not her tool. So we bided our time. And we hid our strengths to lure them into revealing their weaknesses. We pretended to submit so we could observe them up close and learn their spirits. What have we learned? They have no concept of honor and lie constantly to make themselves appear greater and more powerful. Effete and stupid, they understand only the language of violence. They thought they could intimidate us with their metal swords and vibrating bows. And yet when our Garifan riders appeared, all they could do is cower in fear without putting up a real fight. No, the All-Father could not have meant for such a barbarous race to possess paradise. He sent these savages to us as a message, telling us he had prepared a new home for us, already filled with slaves. So this is where the Leguin people are getting their mentality from. And we're going to learn something about their philosophy. Tienro has beaten Timu, who is the crown prince. And Tienro says, I have been betrayed countless times in my life, and I in turn have betrayed those who thought me subjugated by a promise. Experience has taught me that even the bond between parent and child is no guarantee of faith. Obedience can be enforced only through terror and death, not grand gestures invoking the names of the gods or invisible spirits. A scene of carnage will pacify an unruly population more than all the pretty speeches in the world. Timu stared at Tenyo, and for the first time the reality of what he was facing seemed to be sinking in. That is a philosophy of evil. Now here's the response. Good and evil are mere labels we place on deeds that benefit or harm us, and I've wagered the lives of my thanes and warriors upon a mere hope for refuge in the shoreless sea. To them I owe every duty, but to you and yours, nothing. A better life for my people is the only good for which I strive. Then he slaughters the people of Daya. We get some more manifestations of this philosophy coming up a little bit later on, but now articulated by his other people. So we get an interesting discussion between Pekru Tenro and Luan Zia. He says, "You will be remembered as a hero of the Liaku and a traitor to my people," said Luan Zua. "Don't be so morose. The rightness and wrongness of things must be looked at from many perspectives. If you'd not helped us, more grandfathers and grandmothers would have died in winters on the scrublands, and many more children would remain unborn. Tyrants could justify anything with what-ifs." Pekrutenyo laughed. "Then I'll try another tack. If your homeland is so wonderful, isn't it a sin to keep it only for yourselves? Those born in less fortunate lands deserve to enjoy its bounty as well. You've always had a restless soul, and wanderlust is what drove you to leave Dara. Why would you deny others the freedom of movement you view as your own birthright? So you think an invasion is morally the same as a voyage of exploration? I certainly saw a little difference when Admiral Krita explored our land and made himself its king," right? So there is something to this. It's not pure nihilism or pure might makes right, but it is probably an evil philosophy. And we see this, I'm going to close with this important discussion that's happening. Zomi, the great scholar, inventor, character in here, her mother is killed. And this is when Kuni himself is fighting against the emperor of the other peoples, and things are going drastically wrong. Zomi says, "This is my fault. I should never have left home. I should never have decided to make my talents known. My mother is dead because of me." If you believe that, Than Karukono said, "then you're a fool. It is the nature of evil men like Pekyu Tenro to make his victims think they're at fault. Do you think your mother would agree with you? Do you think Luan Zoaji would agree with you?" Zomi stared at the chaotic scene before her. Slowly, her face settled into a look of determination. She would have to use her talents to the utmost and avenge all she loved. So we're going to pick up with some philosophical things in a bit more detail later, and we'll talk a lot more about Zumi as well. But this gives you a good sense of the conflicts that are happening here in this story. Those of you who are familiar with this series know that one of the things I like to do, especially if we have it as an option, is to see what the author, him or herself, actually has to say about their work, their process, some of the thought that goes into it, and even some of their own reflections on characters or world building or other important elements. And with Liu, we're really fortunate in that he's given a massive number of interviews, including some where he's actually talking quite a bit about what is going on in this particular book. So that's what we're going to look at. I want to begin with a Clarke's World interview where he is asked what is important or special to you about the series, the Dandelion Dynasty overall, and what is specifically important or special to you about the conclusion. So Liu says something really quite interesting. The Dandelion Dynasty isn't about any specific culture or history. It's about all the things I care for as a human being living in this moment on this planet. It's about politics, technology, faith and ideals. It's also about being a link in the endless chain of generations, the resilience of evolving traditions, the expression of individuality through relationships, the importance of doubt in self-definition, the need to cling to hope in the face of overwhelming oppression and violence. It's a love song to the diverse classical traditions of our species, an ode to our potential for empathy and grandness of spirit, as well as a philippic against the less noble aspects of our own inconstant nature. It is, in some ways, the purest expression up to this point of my aesthetic vision. I believe it's the best thing I've written, and that makes me so happy. So, a little bit of stuff to dwell on there. You know, a philippic, what is that? It is a speech warning about something. He's got all of these other things, a love song, you know, an ode. There's a lot wrapped up in these novels. It isn't as if he began with just one thing in mind. And isn't it interesting that he says it's not about any specific culture or history, given how closely connected it is to Chinese history. Barnes & Noble reads, he's asked a second big epic fantasy novel, that is Wall of Storms. Quite the change from days of writing short stories at a rapid clip. How has your writing process and way of approaching your work changed? 2 big novels into a series. And so Liu says, I think writing novels has taught me more about the value of patience and being organized. I've learned to use timelines and wikis to track decisions and make sure everything still fits together. It's both easier and harder than writing short fiction. Then he's asked about the first book in the series. With the wheels of Dara established under you in Grace of Kings, what did you want to bring to the fore in Wall of Storms? So Liu says, the Grace of Kings was meant to read like a set of legends about characters who are bigger than life. Their primary concern was the creation of a foundational narrative for a new Dara and its people. The Wall of Storms, on the other hand, is about the interrogation of those legends by the next generation and the age-old but ever-modern practice of appropriating and rewriting foundational narratives to fit a new time and to include new voices. Who can claim to be of the people of Dara and who get to decide its direction are major questions to explore. And they aren't fully answered by the end of this particular novel. He's asked then, Grace of Kings harkens back to Chinese history in the earliest years of the Han Dynasty. Where do the historical parallels for Wall of Storms come from? So he responds, the Grace of Kings draws on Western traditions as much as it does Chinese traditions, though the bones of the story are drawn from the Chu Han contention period before the Han Dynasty. One way to understand the Grace of Kings is to read it as a reimagining of the Chu Han contention through the lens of a narrative woven from strands of Western epics as well as Chinese historical romances. The history, however, is used in a manner so that the story rhymes rather than repeats the history, and the rhymes become ever more approximate in the Wall of Storms. The Wall of Storms also draws on historical events and allegories from multiple other periods of Chinese history and Western history, and some of the most intricate philosophical bits can be traced to Song Dynasty analogs. The other thing that he's asked there, we noticed a marked increase in prominent female characters and a move towards an evolution of depictions and uses of empowered female characters at various levels of society. Was that something deliberate on your part to try and foster? And he says, as I alluded to above, the 3 novels of the trilogy were sketched out along an arc of revolution about how foundational narratives are constructed and reconstructed over time by those who've been excluded from it. It was a plan I followed carefully. Indeed, the Wall of Storms was largely complete by the time The Grace of Kings was published. What you're observing is one dimension along which that revolution is carried out. So isn't that an interesting point? Now, it's not as if Grace of Kings doesn't have compelling female characters, but there are definitely more of them, and they're playing, let's say, a greater role in Wall of Storms. So, moving on, Fanfi Addict, he's given the opportunity to just speak at length about what he's doing. So there's quite a bit here that he says. He begins by saying, to me, silkpunk is a new mythology of the experience of modernity because it's centered around a key punk project, repurposing what was for what will be. These books are my rewriting of the narrative of modernity, and the later books in particular, the modern American national narrative. The Grace of Kings is the first step in this process of remythologizing modernity, a new understanding of the pre-modern order, the what was. The Wall of Storms and the later books tear that understanding down and rebuild it into something at once familiar and different, an alternative understanding of the meaning of the modern, the what will be. But that begs a question. If the Wall of Storms, the second book, seems to be the start of the series, proper, the construction of modernity, why did I write a whole book, The Grace of Kings, that serves only as a prelude? Because a good house requires a good foundation. A driving impetus behind this series is my desire to challenge and interrogate the conventional narrative of modernity, which is often modeled on a particular telling of the story of my country, the US of A. The story of America is most often told using allusions to Western models. Just think about how many aspects of American politics and national culture evoke images of America as a new Rome, and how easily we read Thucydides into every modern conflict involving America, with America starring as the new Athens. However, when you're constrained to one set of allusions, you're limited in how you can push readers to see something new in a familiar tale, or even bolder, to change the narrative entirely. Something radical had to be done. I decided to depart from the New Rome or New Athens model and instead evoke East Asian models in this fantasy epic, recasting of the story of America and, by extension, the narrative of modernity. Thus, I borrowed much of the plot of The Grace of Kings from the True Han contention, as interpreted by the historian Sima Qian, and built up a vocabulary of non-Western political allusions and precedents that could then be drawn on in the reimagining of the epic of modernity. This foundation is what allows the construction of an alternate vision of modernity, an imaginative edifice whose outlines would not come into focus until the later books, when the story moves away from reimagined history into pure invention. This is a vision of modernity, no longer exclusively centered on what we think of as a Western experience. Rather, it melds multiple traditions and myths important to me, from the Iliad to Beowulf, from Paradise Lost to Wuxia, and transforms the True Han contention into the foundational political mythology of a brand new, modern people. The Wall of Storms is where all of that effort begins to pay off. With most of the groundwork out of the way, I can get to the meat of this story about the creation of the Constitution for a new people that, in my view, is a Constitution is not a document, but a set of stories that forms the core of a people's historic analog. Identifying the people of Dara as fantasy Chinese, or the Liuku as fantasy Mongols, or any other people in these books as fantasy fill-in-the-blank group, would be very much misguided. Rather, the central concern of the Wall of Storms and its two sequels is a series of questions. How can a new nation built from a collection of diverse peoples compose a new constitution, agree on a new source of political legitimacy, rally around a new foundational mythology? How do we carry out a political experiment to build a more just society without creating more injustice? What weight should be given to the wisdom of tradition by revolutionaries? Is it a curse or a blessing that a new generation must contend with the weight of history they're born into and live with the decisions made by their forebears? Is a perpetual revolution desirable or even possible? So you notice what he's saying here. This is drawing heavily on East Asia, primarily Chinese history, technology, ways of living, thinking things through, philosophies, but it's not just Chinese fantasy. And it would be a mistake, he says, to think of the people of Dara as just the Chinese or the invading people coming through the wall of storms as being Mongols or even, for that matter, Songnu, any of these peoples that the Chinese struggled with. There's more going on here. Now, he brought up the word silkpunk. We talked about this in the previous session. There's some more amplifications on this notion coming up. In the Nexus interview, he's asked, how does silkpunk compare to other punk subgenres like steampunk? So he says there, the silk in silkpunk refers not to a source of power, but to an entirely different expressive technology language. The inventions in this new language pay homage to and are inspired by actual feats of engineering in East Asian antiquity. For example, Kongming lanterns, powerful auto crossbows, lodestones used to solve practical construction problems, as well as to references to wonders of engineering in fictional texts and oral legends like battle kites, transportation vehicles that move on their own like animals, grand mazes and palaces that harness elemental power. But I'm not limited by either history or the East Asian literary tradition. I also consider what would happen if the technology language of silkpunk were extended to harness entirely new phenomena, such as the mysterious silkmotic force that plays such an important role in the second book, The Wall of Storms. And compared to other punk subgenres, perhaps I take the rebelliousness and disregard for boundaries inherent in the concept more seriously. The engineers in my world are innovators as well as rebels, leading figures in a perpetual revolution that seeks not only to change the mechanical inventions that populate our lives, but also the machinery of social engineering and government. The technology language isn't just about how to build things, but how to construct societies. I hope readers enjoy a fantasy world in which engineers are the wizards and heroes. It's the kind of fantasy world I want to explore. And we're going to come back to that theme of why he writes the things that he does. But let's continue on with the silkpunk idea. He did a Reddit AMA in which this came up, and he's asked, your idea of silkpunk is really interesting and you've executed it supremely well. Did it start out fully formed, or was it a slow process of refining a few ideas to fit the world? So this is a great question, isn't it? Liu says, it evolved over time. Initially, I just wanted a technology aesthetic. How do you extend the principles and materials of classical East Asian engineering into the realm of modernity? Could you build an alternative tech tree? That's a video game reference, of course, that does what modern technology does using this aesthetic. So this is essentially the project of steampunk, but in steampunk you start with the technology vocabulary of Victorian England. Over time, the punk part became more important. It became a way to explore the notion of modernity. Modernity as we experience it is very much rooted in what we would call Western concepts, the Industrial Revolution, the World Wars, colonialism, the nation state, capitalism, communism, Republican democracy. These are all drawn from the history and experience of the West and then became imposed on colonized lands. For much of the world, modernity is thus a translated experience rather than a native one. The language of the colonizer, English, French, German, Japanese, is the language of modernity, and the project of decolonialization involves rerouting modernity in the indigenous and finding a way to reinvent the indigenous to gain a new life in the modern world. Now, that's very different than we're just going to go back to the indigenous, right? He says, I realize that this notion of reappropriating, reclaiming, reinventing, rediscovering is very much at the heart of the punk aesthetic. And so silkpunk gained a political dimension. Once I understood that the aesthetic was about modernity in all senses, not merely material culture, I had to do a lot of rethinking. That's why the Dandelion Dynasty involves not just reimagining of silkpunk material technology, but reinterpreting classical philosophy, reinventing classical institutions, resolving classical problems, all with the eye, notice the theme coming up over and over again, of developing a new vision of modernity. It also became a way for me to rethink and retell the American story. I started by reimagining the legends around the rise of the Han Dynasty and the grace of kings, and ended up engaging with our contemporary dilemma over the American constitutional crisis in Speaking Bones. Silkpunk has definitely ended up very different than how I started, but that's interesting and that's cool to me. Moving slightly in a different direction in speculative fiction and translation, he's going to be asked, you are one of the most prolific authors in writers, translators I've encountered. How do you balance your own writing and translating fiction from Chinese? And Liu says something kind of funny here. I get tagged as prolific often, which baffles me. I write slower than most writers I know, and I don't keep a daily word count. I suspect this reputation has more to do with the fact that I wrote for almost a decade before being published regularly, and so the illusion of being a very fast writer is simply the result of publishing stories accumulated over a long time within a short period. It's the same with my translations. I translated the novels in the three-body series and other works over many years. That they came out in a short time doesn't mean that I did the translation within that time frame. As for balance, it hasn't really been an issue. I accept very few translation commissions, and I turn down most invitations to write short fiction. For my own fiction, I try to pick themes where I think I can give them a unique spin, and I only translate works where I think my skills and translation approach will be beneficial. Going on more about his writing process, Clarke's World interview, he's asked, how do you make a story emotionally effective? Now that is an interesting question, isn't it? He says, this is the theme that we talked about earlier. Ultimately, the only reader I want to please is me. So I try to tell stories that I don't see anyone else telling, and tell them in ways that only I can. It's difficult for any author to write a story that's affecting for the author because there are no secrets, no tricks, no sleight of hand, no way to fool yourself. The only way to tell a story that moves the heart doing the telling is to dig deep and to stick to the truth and only the truth. That stories that stir me deeply, sometimes also move others, feels rather miraculous and gives me hope that communication and intersubjectivity are in fact possible and not mere wishful thinking. The belief that the human can also be human with a capital H. The individual defined by the community. The self, a part of us. These are recurring themes in my fiction, and it's no wonder why they ultimately determine my metafictional approach. And then he's asked a follow-up. Are there any aspects of storytelling writing that are more challenging for you, things you struggle with? How do you deal with those? So he says, the biggest challenge has always been to maintain faith in my own vision and stick to my own aesthetic vision. When you're an artist working in a market economy, there are always 1,000 voices telling you that what you're doing is wrong, unpopular, deviating from the rules and standards. Many are happy to tell you, often without you soliciting advice, you'd be better off doing it this way or that way. Plenty of people who know much less than you about topics important to you would profess to be experts and give you guidance. He says, I've grown less tolerant to this vice over time, and I simply cut off people mercilessly. I encourage you all to do the same. You'll be much happier. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. It's very hard to learn to ignore these voices, and though I've gotten better over time, I still can't claim to have completely transcended the craving for external validation or the skill to bat aside all voices of doubt. I can only strive to do better with each new work and to disregard even more completely the unhelpful opinions of others. Now, I resonate with that so much because I'm actually a big fan of blocking people who I don't think I'll have productive conversations with. I've written about this, I've talked about it. And I also kind of relate to this. I'm going to do things the way I think they ought to be done. I'm going to do videos of the sort that I would like to actually see. And if other people enjoy that, so much the better. It's kind of a miracle that they do, a happy coincidence. And that really is the way to do things, I would say. Can we completely escape the market? Obviously, no. But we don't have to be simply subjected to it. So that enough editorializing on my part. We come back to the issue of Chinese identity in speculative fiction and translation. He's asked, what are some of the hallmarks or tropes or concerns of Chinese sci-fi? And Liu says, I get asked this question a lot, and I always point out the question cannot be answered in a way that's satisfactory to those who want a real answer. Suppose you were to ask 100 American sci-fi authors to name some of the hallmarks, tropes, concerns of American sci-fi. You would surely get back 100 different sets of answers. Every author has their own concerns, politics, identities, obsessions, and interpretations for what it means to be American and what makes a work sci-fi. Thus, the sci-fi written by each individual American author will be distinct. Chinese sci-fi, insofar as that category has meaning, is just as contested, diverse, idiosyncratic, personal, political, and resistant to generalization. China is a society that is undergoing tumultuous changes. In a few decades, China has experienced the same kinds of transformations that took other states centuries. It's at once one of the most unequal societies on earth, as well as one of the most innovative, a place where postmodern political consciousness and protest identities coexist with 19th century style oppression. It's impossible for anyone, even those who consider themselves part of the Chinese sci-fi community, to reduce Chinese sci-fi to easy generalizations. This doesn't mean you won't see a lot of statements like Chinese sci-fi is/isn't blank around the web. For the most part, they're made by people who have no idea what they're talking about. As a general rule, the more confident someone can tell you what Chinese sci-fi is about, the less you should listen to them. We get another thing coming up in the Reddit AMA. Somebody said, I've been reading a lot of the Chinese sci-fi you've translated. What are the biggest theme differences you notice between China's sci-fi as opposed to Western sci-fi? Why do you think the themes differ? Notice what he says once again. I generally find broad, sweeping generalizations about large bodies of literature not useful. A lot of the time, these generalizations are made by pundits trying to make a point, so the writer twists the evidence to fit their pet theory. As I've said before, if you ask 100 writers to describe the themes in Western sci-fi, you get 100 different answers. I think you learn a lot more about the individual writers based on their answers than you do about Western sci-fi as a result. So, I like to focus on individual stories and individual authors, but even then, I try to avoid generalizations. For example, Xia Jia has a way of describing the loneliness of modernity I find very moving and beautiful, but as she evolves from one story to the next, I don't think it's fair to call that a recurring theme. Likewise, Ma Boyong has a way of seamlessly melding modernity with the classics that excites me every time I see it, but also evolves from story to story. And I don't want to reduce him to one thing, even if that thing happens to be something I love. As someone who dislikes having labels and generalizations applied to myself, I have to give other authors the same courtesy. And so I avoid, as much as possible, reducing their individuality into some broader category that depersonalizes them. He's asked again, I love how you seamlessly weave in Chinese and broader Asian influences into your world building. How do you go about finding inspiration? Are there any good English language resources out there for those of us interested in learning more about Chinese or Asian culture, history, and literature? So he says, I find the best way to deal with using, and he puts it in quotes, Asian influence is just to forget something is Asian. By marking something as Asian, the act automatically excludes it from being American and makes it foreign, something you have to struggle to reshape to feel at home, to be domesticated. Instead, I take the approach of, I'm an American, so when I create something, it's automatically and by definition American. If I want to make a reference to Zhuge Liang, it's because I'm doing so as an American, no different than my making a reference to Napoleon. I'm not going to explain or justify myself. I'm just going to do it. If you don't feel the need to explain, generally the readers who you care about won't feel the need to be explained to either. They can look it up in this connected age. However, if the generally available explanation in English isn't right, then you have to do explain to avoid misunderstandings. I'm going to bring up one other piece that he tells us something interesting about. This is in the Chicago Review of Books, and he's asked, does your own writing inform your translation work or vice versa? Notice what he says. The glib answer would be, there's no influence at all. For the most part of my decade-plus career as a writer, I had no interest in translations. I got into doing translations purely by accident, as my friend Chen Qifan, one of the most dynamic voices of contemporary Chinese sci-fi, asked me to take a look at a commissioned translation of one of his stories to see how it read in English. I started making some notes on how to improve the translation to better capture his unique, sardonic voice, then decided it would be easier if I just did a translation of his story from scratch. That translation, the first one I ever did, ended up winning a science fiction translation award, and I realized I was perhaps in a good position to help introduce my fellow Anglophone readers to the exciting fiction coming out of China. Since my primary interest is writing original fiction, I've always treated my translation work as an entirely separate category of creative endeavor. My own fiction is completely different from the kind of work I like to translate in theme and style, and it would be a poor translator who infects everything he translates with his own voice. And I can say that as a translator myself, obviously not from Chinese, but from French and German and Latin and classical Greek. That rings very true to me. As a translator, you don't want it to sound like your translation, right? You want to convey the person who's you're giving voice to in a different language. So he says, I begin every translation with a study of the author's voice, which is probably the most unique aspect of any writer's work, trying to figure out how to recreate a voice in a different language is the most challenging task in any translation effort. I think that's right. He goes on to say, but it's also the most fun. A more serious and nuanced answer to the question would be, it's impossible to tell. Everything a writer writes is inevitably influenced by everything they read, and it would be strange to think the novels I translated, which I must have read 10, 20 times during the process of translation, dissecting every phrase and tracing out every allusion, don't influence my own writing in some undefinable way. Similarly, since a translation, notice what he says, is a performance, and no performance can be isolated from the performer's life, it would be strange to think that my translations aren't influenced in some manner by my own explorations in fiction making. But to tease out the exact influence in either direction would be like trying to trace out how a butterfly's fluttering wings in Texas ultimately contributed to the typhoons on the shores of Taiwan. What an interesting observation to close with here. And notice the common themes. He's made the case over and over again that what he's doing is not simply taking a Chinese set of tropes, ideas, and putting them into Western fantasy. Something different is going on. The reconceiving modernity comes up over and over and over again for him. This is a bigger project that just happens to take the form of some amazing fantasy novels that are in this evolving silkpunk genre. So I think these are some really awesome interviews for getting a sense of what Ken Liu is up to in these works. So I hope that helps you out. I've certainly found these interviews illuminating myself, and to some degree, I could even say inspiring. As somebody who teaches philosophy for a living and has been studying it now really for about 35 years, and as somebody who early on had a significant interest in classical Chinese philosophy, the philosophical discussions that are being provided here, elaborating like an entire mental universe, we might say, in Wall of Storms, really catch my attention. And I do want to begin with a reference that's happening early on in the work that I thought is quite striking. So this is a discussion between two of the, we could say, most important philosophical figures in here. We get to see the education of one by the other. We have Leguin, the great, not just philosopher, but experimenter, the lover of gin, the advisor to the emperor before he's even the emperor, and the discoverer of the regularities in the Wall of Storms. And he's talking with Zomi, who's going to be a majorly important character, rising from a low status, very brilliant woman. We're going to talk a lot more about them in a bit. So anyway, we have this interesting discussion that is taking place where he says, in the debate between Khan Fiji and Ra Oji, it's not clear-cut that Khan Fiji had the worse argument. True, things are different in the islands from the Ano homeland, but the hearts of people with all their ideals, passions, greedy, covetousness displayed side by side with high honor, selfish interest, driving noble sacrifice, those are not. Khan Fiji was not wrong to say that respect for the wisdom of the past, for paths carved out by generations of lived experience, should not be disregarded overnight. I've never seen you at a loss for words before, said a grinning Leguin. Well, you're actually making Khan Fiji sound like a true sage. Leguin laughed. I haven't always given you the fairest presentation of the moralists, I suppose, and that is my fault. But now here's the key payoff. Just as the four major schools of philosophy and the 100 schools of minor branches of learning all have something to teach us, it is a balance between the new and the old that we must strive for. She responds, I thought we were striving for truth. We're not gods. We can't always tell truth from error, and so it's better to be cautious. So what we've got going on here, four major schools of philosophy, which we'll talk about shortly, 100 other schools of other arts. And we're going to see how important some of those other schools are for the warfare that's taking place. For example, the silkpunk force, which is what we identify as electricity, or the art of dissection and figuring out what makes the Garifins actually have the capacity to belch flame and to rise in the air, which turns out to be hydrogen, as we can recognize, not helium, as the other gas that was being used for the airships. All of these things are playing an important role. So, do we have exact analogs between the four great schools that are described here and the classical schools of Chinese philosophy? Not exactly. I mean, it's very easy to say, the moralists, that looks very, very similar to the Confucians, but it's not exactly the same. The Fluxists, the great opposition to the Confucians in the Taoists, but not exactly the same. And then we have the incentivists, and we can say, we also see where they're coming in. Those are the legalists of the Qin dynasty. Yes, there's great parallels there. But then who are the patternists? Are they supposed to be, as we saw suggested, the Mohists, one of the great schools that ended up eventually more or less dying out? Possibly. Are they the Five Elements / Yin Yang school that wound up being taken up by so many others? Possibly. Are they corresponding in any way to the dialecticians or other schools? It's a little bit hazier. So let's jump in and look at some of the important discussions that are taking place. So first, we have this interesting discussion that's taking place. Mimi, who's also going to be called by the name of the important scholar in training shortly, is seeing a debate taking place between a moralist and a fluxist. And the issue is about what is going on with the sun and why it looks larger at some places. So the scholars are arguing, and one of them is saying, your explanation is wrong. It is not wrong, said the first scholar, his face turning red. The great sage Configi explained that nature, like human society, follows a discernible structure of hierarchy. The sun is as far above the earth as the emperor is above the common people. It only follows that the gods must have intended the sun to be at its greatest distance from the earth when it's at its apex, symbolizing the grace and nobility of the imperial throne. Well, what about the noonday heat, my learned friend? Asked the second scholar. That is easily explained. The first scholar took a drink from his cup of tea and furtively glanced at the crowd around him. Now that so many people were watching, he had to win this debate to save face. And he goes on and gives some sort of, argument. And Mimi says, does the world follow a design that can be perceived? Is nature a model for society? So what is natural is also what is just? She had never heard of such arguments before, and she was mesmerized. The learned men seemed to think that the world itself was a kind of speech that could be decoded. She remembered her attempts to understand the conversations of the gods as a child. She yearned for such knowledge that would allow her to interpret the signs of the gods, to see through the veil of the world, and get a glimpse of truth, capital T. You moralists always assume the conclusion before the argument, said the second scholar contemptuously. It is just as Ra-Oji said. A disciple of Configi is the world's most powerful lens, for he bends all rays of evidence to focus on his desired opinion. Even if he's idle and has an empty belly, he would argue it is the fault of the food for not recognizing his moral superiority and actively seeking his belly. In the end, a moralist convinces none but himself. And then there's a response. You fluxists are good at poking fun at seekers of truth while offering nothing of use yourselves except witticisms, said the first scholar, his voice trembling with rage. He says, what's your explanation for the sun's changing size then? And the other guy says, who knows? And he offers a number of different possible interpretations. And then he says, your approach is wrong. We need not force nature into models drawn by our desires. And then a little bit later, going with the flow is not the path to approach the reality of the universe. I'm no incentivist, but Anji was at least headed in the right direction when he pointed out that learned men must understand the world and improve it, for we're not dumb beasts or dandelions scattered by the roadside, but endowed with a godly impulse to transform the earthly realm to bring it closer to heaven. Then the other says, the reality of the universe must be experienced, not constructed. Mimi says, what's it like to ponder such questions all day? To not limit one's thoughts to the weather and the harvest and the fishing haul, to not have to struggle to plan for the next meal and the meal after that, but to be able to imagine and debate the substance of the sun and to believe it is possible to read the larger patterns of life. The scholars went on debating in that vein. And then she realizes, oh crap, I came to market to sell our stuff. And she meets a man who says, you seem fascinated by that debate. What were you thinking just now? And her answer is, why do so many sages have family names that end in G? The man looked stunned for a second, then laughed. And he says, I'm sorry, it's refreshing to hear an original observation. I meant no offense at all. And so Luan, is actually going to arrange for her wares to be bought at a considerable price, and he will take her on as a student. So we learn in a later conversation between them about the paternists. Namoji was the founder of the patternist school of philosophy. He lived centuries ago when Zana was a land far more primitive than the other Tiro states. He tied silk ribbons to wild geese and proved the birds migrated south for winter and returned north for the spring. He was the first to devise a kite with 2 strings so that they could be guided to trace out dizzying patterns in the sky. Namoji believed that nature was a book whose language was mathematics. By careful observation and testing, we can plumb its depths and map out its patterns. Even the gods are subject to the patterns of nature, and though they're able to read more of it than we can. And then he says, you've created a map of winds with the kite balloon, and now you're ready to fly wherever you wish. A balloon is home in air, the natural element of patternism. Zomi looked around the sky and sea, but instead of emptiness, she seemed to see gusts of wind as a broad three-dimensional avenues and streets in an invisible city. A big smile broke out on her face. I like patternism. More, teach me more. So he has her doing things with the balloon, and then he says to her, what you've just practiced is an illustration of the incentivist school of philosophy. As the name indicates, its natural element is fire. And he says, the incentivist school was founded by Ji Anji, the youngest of the great sages. He's a modern, not an ancient Anno. Ji Anji believed that people are by nature lazy and resist change, and it's the duty of the wise ruler to incentivize them with proper rewards and punishments. And, she says, my mother had a simpler way of saying that. Get out of bed or I'll throw a burning lump of coal in the blankets. And Luan says, what Jianji meant was the stress the moralist placed on cultivating virtue was misplaced. Most people are irredeemably selfish, and it's sufficient for the ruler to adjust the laws to encourage the right behavior. So, we're getting all these interesting little lessons going on. Later on, here's another one. We learn that he's teaching her about Ra-Oji, who says a moralist is someone who can tell you how everyone ought to behave except himself. And he says, Ra-Oji was quite a character. We don't know much about his life, except that he was about a generation younger than Kanfiji. He must have come from a very learned family. And then he goes on and he says, as a young man, Ra-Oji made his name by debating Kanfiji. He debated the one true sage? I've never heard of such a thing. Oh, I think the moralists don't like to be reminded of how their great teacher could also be challenged. This is, what was the debate about? Funeral rites. So Kanfiji has this elaborate schema that's hierarchically organized and justifications about that. And she says, let me guess, Kanfiji probably also had different rules for men and women. Ah, you're thinking like a patternist and you'd be right. So Kanfiji argued the rights were important because they enacted and embodied the respect due to rank. Ranks are made real. The technical term in moralism is reified through practice. Notice that term was used later by the empress and regent Jin, wasn't it? Reified. So, abstract principles are given life through performance, just like applying the same rules to friends and foes gives meaning to honor. Giving away possessions supplies content to charity. Reducing punishments and taxes provides significance to mercy. The adherence to seemingly arbitrary codes of behavior can reify a structure for society that leads to stability. And then Zomi ponders this. But there's no soul to such performances. All that anyone would be doing is acting out roles dictated by Kanfiji. It wouldn't be real honor or mercy or charity if all the king is doing is following rules. The one true sage would say that just as intent drives action, action can also drive intent. By acting morally, one becomes morally. This all sounds terribly stiff and inflexible. Well, that's why the element of the moralist is the earth, the stable foundation for statecraft. What did Ra-Oji say? He began his debate by saying nothing. What? You have to realize Ra-Oji was a very striking young man. And they go on as well. He talks about this buffalo. So there's a lot of interesting references going on here, right? So in the end, Raoji says, in 100 years, Master Kanfiji, you and I will both be dust, and even the worms and birds who feast on our flesh will also have traveled through multiple revolutions of the wheel of life. Our lives are finite, but the universe is infinite. I will return to the great flow of the universe. Such honor can never be matched by mortal rites enacted by those obeying dead words, copying out of a book. So we have this great conflict between philosophies. We also get to see a fluxist in action. Thera and Farah, the princesses, both meet up with this lady. And the lady is going to, introduce them to fresh lotus seeds. But she also, when she's asked, I take it you're a fluxist, mistress. She says, I don't care much about labels. But I do think Raoji was closer to the truth than the other Ano philosophers. Emperor, beggar, princess, maid, for all our toils and struggles. In the end, the flow governs us all. And she's taught them about the great pleasures of life. And then we get this interesting thing. But what you said can't be right, Farah suddenly piped up. I mean about the great pleasures. Why not? You didn't mention the love of a handsome man, said Farah. That's the most important thing. Whatever makes you think that? It's the stories the older girls tell, and all the plays put on by the traveling puppet opera troupes. Lady Mira killing herself for love, Princess Kikami killing for love, Lady Z jumping to the Liro for love. Come and sit, said the lady. Then she quirked her brows at Thera. By your tone, I take it you don't approve of love much. And she says, well, songs of men are about friendship, war, sights of faraway lands, and the sounds of the eternal sea. But songs of women are all about love, right? We're going to see, just to jump very, very far ahead, when Thera is talking with Zomi, who they've both fallen in love with each other, and Thera is saying, I need to go and embrace my destiny as a daughter of the house of Dandelion. I'm going to go marry this foreign prince and lead a revolution in the homeland of our invaders, right? So we're going to get this interesting discourse. So she says, I will lead a revolution. And Zomi says, I've never had much patience with the passive mysticism of the Fluxus. And she says, Zomi, my love, discerning and accepting the flow of life is not passivity. I strive to dissolve the sorrows of two people. After a while, Zomi nodded, but she couldn't help the tears streaming down her face. You speak of destiny, but what is destiny but accumulated chance made into a story in retrospect? Perhaps you're right, but this is the way I want to tell my story. I love you, Zomi, but this is what I want. Respect that. So this is the end then? Thera shook her head. Just because we'll be apart, continents apart, doesn't mean that our love ends. You and I will both have many other loves, many grand romances and devotions and enlargements of the soul, but this is our first, and it will always be special. No matter how much time passes or how far apart we are, our love will remain true. We're Dyrans streaking past each other in the vast deep, but our shared lightning flash will illuminate the darkness ahead until we're embraced by the eternal storm. Zomi wiped her eyes. You would have done well in the grand examination. You composed beautifully. I'm named the dissolver of sorrows for a good reason, Thera said, her lips curling into a grin. You look lovely even with tears, like an orchid blossoming after the rain. But a little bit before that in this section, Thera says something that was said in the earlier work, right? She says, what we share is special. There will never be another like you. You hear the voice in my heart when I hum a hesitant tune. You're the mirror of my soul, Zomi, my wakeful weakness. But our lives should be large enough to contain multitudes of love. I've never liked those tales that define an entire life by a romance. Remember Luan Xiaji's poem? Mewling child, cooing parent, grand-souled companions, brothers, wakeful weakness, empathy that encompasses the world. Zelazny spoke of many loves in his life, only one of which was romance. He spoke of friendship, of filial devotion, of amour, of grandness of soul, of loving your work. We're defined by the web of our loves, not one grand romance. What a beautiful sentiment that we get there. Now, I want to sort of wrap this up in part by talking about another love that's going to develop between a moralist, who is the heir designate of the emperor, but now has been captured by the invaders. So, Peake Tenro sent emissaries to persuade Prince Timu every day. Tenro is the emperor of the invaders. Today's Kashima was named Warapin, a renowned incentivist from Dasu, and we get this interesting engagement between the two. So, Prince Temu, Grand Secretary Lugo Krupo once said the wise ruler should flow with the currents of history rather than resist them. And the prince responds, and am I supposed to listen to the words of Lugo Krupo, the despised advisor of the tyrant Mapidire? Besides, if he's so wise, why did he resist the tides of history and cling to the Zana Empire? Right? And so Weira says, surely the wise prince does not subscribe to the notion that victors have a monopoly on the truth. Krupo served a lord who's lost, but his wisdom is eternal. Collaborators with the invaders are apparently blind to irony. Since you're so observant of the tides, why don't you enlighten me with the wisdom I'm ignorant of? The Leiku are the scourge of the gods, said Weirapin. By next spring, a new fleet of Leiku ships will come, bringing even more warriors and garifins. Do you wish to see Dara laid waste? Do you wish to see more people die? No one has to die if the Leiku stop killing. The Leiku kill only because the House of Dandelion refuses to yield. The emperor places his own weal above that of the people, which is why he has not ordered Dara to surrender. Prince Timu stopped and glared at Weira. The barbarians have only conquered 2 islands, and look at what they've done to the place. If we surrender, all Dara will be reduced to this. So we're getting an interesting clash of philosophies there. Now, Timu is a moralist, but he's going to meet up with this princess, and her name is Tavanaki, and she is going to ask him, do you think I'm pretty? She's riding Garifin into battle, and she seemed to have no shame at all, which was strange, but also attractive. Good, said the princess. That I can tell is not a lie. Why do you men of Dara lie so much? I haven't the faintest idea of what the princess speaks. I've been studying the people of Dara for a while, and you all think one thing but say another. For example, when Zato Ruthi, your old teacher, came to meet us, he thought we were all barbarians, barely better than animals, yet pretended to treat us as honored guests. The wealthy and powerful among you wish to have more money and power, but they always say they're trying to take care of the people. A look of anger flashed through Timo's eyes. I'm no hypocrite. Aren't you? Then why do you want to watch people starve? I'm trying to prevent people from starving, he says. And they have arguments back and forth. And he finds this girl's arguments were not like the arguments he was used to from other emissaries of the Peake. Instead of quoting from the Ano sages, which he was skilled at countering, she seemed to look at things in a new way. And he's going to get introduced to new things through her, right? She gets him drunk after riding with her on her Garifin, right? She says, have some kyofer with me. And they drink this fermented milk. And she says, do you hate my people so much you can't even share a drink with me? We don't offer kyofer to anyone except those we esteem. And then he thinks, all life is an experiment. Isn't that what Father always says? He drinks 3 times. She has him lie down. And then she seduces him. And they are now involved, right? And she says, we're going to get married. She spoke to him of the wedding plans, a simple affair that would combine Liaku and Dara elements, of the eventual coronation ceremony, of the need for him to think of the future, not the past. She did not drug him again. And he's wavering. He'd allowed the flame of desire to drive out reason, to incinerate the words of the Anno sages, to turn the virtue he'd been so carefully guarding into something bestial, something base. And he thinks, I can't, see my family after this. But she tells him something. When the Leguin wants something, we simply take it. Don't let others tell you what you should do or want. Our lives are brief flash storms in the eternal scrublands of time, and we honor all creation by living lustfully and passionately. Shame is a lie told to you by those who would enslave you rather than free you. So, her voice soothed him like a mug of iced plum tea in summer or a cup of warmed rice wine in winter. Family should lift you up, not put you down, Timu thought. Wasn't that what the Anno sages always said? And so they are now involved, and we're going to get this great war going on. Eventually, she is going to replace her father after his death as the new empress of the invaders, but married to somebody who has a claim to the empire. And we're going to see a great 10-year truce being formed between the invaders, who, by the way, they're reinforcements are not actually going to get there, as we're going to find out. And the people of Dara under the empire. And that is where, in effect, with the other interesting element of the man who is another prince from that other island getting married to Theru, we're going to see this very interesting ending taking place, bringing together all of this great philosophy, technology, adventure story, statecraft, all of these amazing elements brought together in something that's not a resolution as such. It's not a finish, but opens the way for the next novels to come. So, I'm going to bring this to an end here. If you haven't read these novels, hopefully this inspires you to go on and check out Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty. Those of you who already have read it, hopefully I did some justice to some of the important elements and dimensions of this great work. And down the line, we will go past the Wall of Storms and into the final 2 volumes of this great silkpunk narrative.